So cool. Okay, let's do this. My name is Allison Samuels, and I'm here on behalf of the Level Up Project, which is an initiative that I began officially over the last few months, but is something that in many forms has been on my mind for a lot of years. I'm honestly still in a bit of shock that this is actually happening right now, that all of you are here, and that hundreds of people around the country and around the world are participating in this project, which we launched not even a month ago. It is totally wild. It is I would love to welcome you all to our very first ever workshop, like week one, day one, with the Level Up Project, and coming to support our vision of accessible education and knowledge sharing and network building. All of us at the Level Up Project have an innate sense that the industries we work within need to change and that we are individually responsible for helping that shift along. It is through both small and daily habit changes alongside collective action that we think these systems can be recreated to support more people. And all of you are part of that creating right now. An idea that I have been returning to a lot in the last few months, articulated by activist and abolitionist Mariame Kaba, is that we don't have to build things that last forever. We should not need a project like this to exist in the first place, because free and accessible education and knowledge sharing should be baseline. I started this project as just one of many resources and stepping blocks on the way to greater equity in predominantly physical skills-based fields of craft and design. It's like really exciting to me that this project is already growing and shifting to better serve everyone who would like to participate. And I am, again, beyond thrilled that all of you are here and to be collectively building with you in real time. As a reminder, this model works. That is allowing anyone to participate for free, including materials if that's part of the workshop, because we are collecting all of the dollars into one pot and then redistributing them back out. We believe that everyone contributing in accordance with their wealth and privileges is one way to achieve a more equitable social system. And it's totally wild that this is like happening in real time, that you are all making this happen right now. So I would just remind you that if you care to continue donating to the project, we have a website that you can donate through, and the Eventbrite page that you registered on is live still through the end of tonight. You're welcome to donate if you would like. All of the proceeds from our ticket sales and donations are going to Arts Business Collaborative and Map for Youth. We're gonna split them, or split the proceeds between those two organizations, which are really fucking cool. Very cool. Sorry for all the children in the room. If you feel strongly about the project, please feel free to donate. I will be the admin for tonight. Feel free to drop any questions or comments in the chat box, or DM me separately through the chat box if you don't want to share your thoughts with everybody. I'm gonna be turning off my video just to like focus and stuff. And we'll have Renee spotlighted through the whole time. Feel free to use the chat to just like check in with everybody here as you want. We're gonna have all of your sound on and all of your videos on if you want throughout the workshop. And if there are any problems, we'll like ask you to turn your sound off if anything is happening. If you have questions, again, feel free to put them in the chat box. I will either like save your questions for the end. We'll have like a 15 to 20 minute Q&A time, or I will ask in real time to Renee, but Renee is not going to be like really looking at the chat, just FYI. Also, in advance, apologies for any technical glitches. This is very new to all of us, so we are going to do our very best. And yeah, that's about it right now. So before we get started, a little bit about Renee. Renee is here with us from the Lower East Side Ecology Center as their compost project manager. Yay, Renee. Renee has committed to building healthy soils and communities of people and microbes through the art and science of composting for over a decade. Her work has included managing public space composting programs, leading workshops and trainings, facilitating community construction projects, and collaborating with others on growing the movement around food waste prevention. When not composting, Renee can be found making pottery or tending to her garden. And Renee and I actually met on Instagram because she's a ceramicist, and I didn't realize that she was also works with the Lower East Side Ecology Project. So it's like a fun little fact. I am totally thrilled that Renee is joining the Level Up Project with us right now and adding her expertise and wealth of knowledge to our growing network of skilled people. And on that note, I would love to turn over the virtual floor to Renee and jump right in.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that lovely intro. And yeah, to echo all that Allison said about excitement around the Level Up Project and see where this goes over the next months, years, future. But yeah, welcome. If I wanted to also just get we surveyed the crowd where folks were from. But I'm also curious of why people signed up for the workshop and why composting is something that's important or exciting or interesting to you. So if you don't mind just like unmuting yourself, jump in, share why composting is interesting to you, or add a comment in the chat box. I'd love to kind of get a survey of why folks are here.
Hi, Renee. My name's Effie. I'm in Brooklyn. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I've been composting in Brooklyn for about 4 years now. Small composting of like putting scraps in my freezer and then taking them to the local garden here. But I do want to learn more about composting without a garden, composting in apartments, or when I do get land. How do I do that on a larger scale? And also, like, what things can be composted and what can't be composted. I know New York City has certain laws, but I know composting can be more than what is allowed here. So, did want to know. Thank you.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Hi, Irene Osborne. I've been composting for a number of years. I love to cook. I live in the Bronx and have a backyard, and I've been gardening extensively during the pandemic, and I realized I could do a lot better. Why buy compost when I could make it? I've got a bunch of scraps here that I collect, but I want to be sure I'm doing it right, because sometimes it just kind of sits there and I have to remember what to do. So any tips would be great.
Cool. Great.
Helen.
We'll have all the tips. Yes.
Helen says that she has a garden and wants to stop buying compost for it. They have a vegan pile compost in their yard, but the oak tree eats it all.
Great.
Hello, I'm Hannah, they, them, and this is Steve. And we have a rolling compost that we inherited in their backyard in Brooklyn. The people who lived here before us left it. So we've been very fortunate to get to compost in that for the past 4 years. But we really don't know a ton about composting. We've just been doing the kind of basics, and we're definitely interested in learning a lot more and hoping, to just do more with our compost.
We've got some great responses in the chat too. Anyone else want to chime in? Going once, twice. Great. So It's really exciting to hear that some of you have already started to dip your toes into the composting world, and that there's kind of this like overall interest in kind of like gardening, outdoors, and sustainability, and as we see, like when you're cooking and you can just like have a bowl with your food scraps and like you're putting it to a beneficial use. It's exciting to see those themes kind of come up amongst all y'all too. So this evening we'll be like getting our hands digitally dirty with compost, and what we're gonna do is first we're gonna set the stage by talking about soil and really about like why composting matters and why it's important. Then we're gonna talk about what compost is, and then we'll start to get into the details of like troubleshooting, like how to manage various types of compost bins or compost systems. And I'll kind of show you the work that we do here at the Ecology Center as well. So does that sound good? Expectations are clear from everyone? Great. So soil. If over the last couple of years, I've become like a big soil nerd. Like I got into composting because I was more just interested in like the sustainability side of things. And like I loved the community garden I was at, and it was just like, oh yeah, compost. You just like throw stuff in a pile and it'll do something, and it'll smell, but whatever, that's okay. It doesn't have to smell, which we'll get to later. But soil is something that I've like started to learn more about through my composting journey, and that like one of the incredible things is that like healthy soils are alive. Like in a tablespoon of soil, there are more living organisms than there are humans on the planet. So imagine that, like in a tablespoon of soil, there's more than 7 billion living organisms, which like blows my mind. And to think of like, when we think of ecological health and we're like saving like forests and grasslands to protect different like large animals, like to think about what are we doing to care for these microscopic little critters that like we don't even really think about on a day-to-day basis. So like coming at it from that framework, and like soil sustains life in a larger way as well, where it helps to create the framework for habitat. It is the basis for growing food. And also the health of our soils plays a really, really important role in climate and weather patterns. It's one of those elements that really like touches every aspect of our lives, and kind of like once soils start to become unhealthy, you really see like how the earth responds. And like for one of the examples I like to point to is like the Dust Bowl that happened in like what was it, like the early 1900s, where these native grasslands were actually like really healthy, and the tall grasses were able to like collect water and like evaporate into the air, and like things were able to grow and life was able to be sustained on these grasslands in the Midwest. Agriculture comes in, everything is cut down, and it's like once you cut out these grasses, which were able to like hold on to water and moisture and like create natural weather patterns, it like disrupted that natural weather pattern, and there was no more like regular rainfalls. The soils were not healthy in order to like absorb any water, and so whenever it did rain, all the water would just like flow right over the tops of these horribly unhealthy soils, and it did not create for a sustainable agricultural system. The other big example I like to point to a little bit more in the now is big agriculture, and how perhaps a lot of you have been tuned in to like the reliance on pesticides and herbicides and chemicals in our big agricultural systems. And when you add these chemical fertilizers to soil, you're basically killing off any of the beneficial microbes and critters that are in the soil, and making that soil dependent on an annual application of this chemical fertilizer. And so it really like disrupts natural systems. And if you stop applying these chemical fertilizers to the soils, it's not even able to like bounce back right away to grow healthy food, and really kind of disrupts these natural ecosystems. So talking a lot about soil and the role of compost in it, I actually, in the event description, I recommended that if you wanted to grab a handful of soil, you can do so. Did anyone end up grabbing a handful of soil, a soil sample to share? It's okay if not. It's kind of a weird ask. But so I'm just gonna show you, I grabbed some soil, and you can kind of see like this material is like, it's got some roots in it. It's got rocks. It's, I don't know how much it can convey, but it's like kind of sandy, and like it's an okay material. It doesn't have much of a smell. It feels kind of grainy. It's more like gray in color, but definitely has some browns too. So healthy soil and like soil composition is made up of approximately, actually one sec, I'm gonna share my screen, which I'll be popping back and forth. So great. Healthy soil is approximately 50% solid matter and 50% pore or open space. So that basically means that like our soil is mostly like air and water, and the other 50% is made up of like minerals, which are like tiny rocks and things that have been living or once lived, which is what we call organic matter. The other thing you might remember maybe from your high school soil science class is like the soil texture when we talk about sand, silt, and clay. Folks remember that, sand, silt, and clay? And when those three elements are in like a perfect balance, that's where we get this soil texture called loam. And I feel like in the gardening world and the agriculture world, this word loam is really like tossed around and as this like idealized soil structure. And just to kind of break it down to say like that's what loam is. And if you have an imbalance of your material's too sandy or it's too silty, and you want to reach this like state of loam, of like a balance of these three elements, what you can do is add compost. And as we talk about like building healthy soils, we always come back to like compost as this like magical element that can build health in our soils and restore soils back to a state where it can like sustain habitat, grow food, and really act as a source of like green infrastructure in our ecosystem. So so now soil, a lot of, you can get like really heavy once you start getting into soil science, but any quick questions just around like the basics of soils and soil typologies, and before we dive into the compost side of things? I'll pause for a second.
Effie asks, how do we test soil?
How do we test soil?
Also, is that how you pronounce your name? Or Effie?
It's FA.
So you can test soil. There's different soil testing labs.
She wants to see if it's okay to plant.
Yep. Okay. And you can, so the Brooklyn Soil Lab at the Brooklyn College is a great local resource for testing your soil. And if you check them out, they'll give you instructions on like how to take a soil sample and how to send it into them. And they will then report back and tell you if there's like any like heavy metals or contaminants in your soil that would maybe like caution you away from wanting to grow food in that soil. So a lot of times, like across New York City with our like deep industrial past, and even like talking about leaded soil, like leaded gasoline and in the vehicles that used to drive across the city. There's a lot of like persistent lead in the soils in our city. So if you have a backyard and you want to plant food in it, I recommend actually, like, one, you can test your soil, but likely enough, you'll want to create like a raised bed. So if you create a raised garden bed and add in soil that you can buy from the store, you can add compost to that store-bought soil, and then you know that that soil that you've added to this raised bed is clean. It doesn't have any like historic lead in it. And that is a good way to kind of remedy any potential for soil contamination. Let's see, another question. Then, if healthy soil is only 5% organic matter, then how do plants grow in potting soil, which is mostly compost and not actual soil? So in a lot of potting soil mixes, like, we're getting to like the molecular end of things where there's still minerals, there's still water, and there's still that air. And that's kind of the essences of what plants need to start to grow. So it's like potting soil is created with these materials that create this like more, I don't know, like a perfect house plant scenario. But it's just basically kind of recreating the elements that would be in a soil if you were growing just like in the soil in your backyard.
Watts also asks, how long does it take for compost to turn into healthy soil?
We will get into that, but it actually, and this actually goes right into the next thing I'm about to talk about too. So we can come back to soils throughout it, but I'm gonna move on to the next topic, which is just, what is compost? Compost is basically just a human-derived intervention into the natural process where decomposition happens naturally. Like if you think of going for a walk in the woods.
Wait, Renee, hold on one sec. I'm hearing some feedback. I'm wondering if anybody's mic is on. It looks like perhaps Alexandra. I think Alexandra might have been it. Okay.
Thanks.
Let's continue.
So decomposition happens like just like if you imagine leaves falling on the forest floor and slowly they decompose, or you come across a log that is like slowly becoming brittle, like when you're on a hike in the woods or walking through Prospect Park. And composting is actually like the human managed process, and it kind of speeds up decomposition in a way that if you dropped an apple core in the forest, it would probably take like a lot longer to break down than if it was put into an actively managed compost pile. So, and another thing I just want to talk about in terms of like language and the words that we use to describe composting. So a lot of times people will say, I'm going to drop off my compost, but really the compost is the finished product that you put on your houseplants. And a lot of times you will be composting your food scraps. And another word that we use to describe food scraps is organic waste. And organic waste is actually this larger term that talks about anything that was once living or has like some plant roots, living organisms, food, leaves, anything that kind of like was alive and of a plant material. Like we are, as humans, like we are organic waste as well once we are not living anymore. But human composting is a whole other topic to dive into. So just to kind of show you the difference, so we've got, I'm on my phone, so we've got our food scraps, and this is what you can add into a compost pile. Then we have, I've got compost that like just came off of a compost pile, and it still has a lot of these like woody wood chips. Unfortunately, we get things like plastic Or fruit stickers are another common culprit that we see in a compost pile. But what we do before applying this to a garden bed is actually sift it to take out any of the contamination. And what we have here is the fresh, very finely sifted, finished compost. And this is the ideal stuff that you'd want to put like right on your garden bed to help the plants grow. So what's so special about, well, actually, before I go into that, then the other thing to show, I've actually got some, when we talk about decomposition and everything that plays a role in decomposition, there are all these like little microbes. Worms play a big role. We've got our worm. But like, this is a great example of like the fungal networks that you can see, like all these white threads right here are the fungal networks that start to take over a compost pile once it starts to cool. And these really are great at breaking down the larger woody material that you also want to add into your compost pile. So as I said, once you start entering soil science nerd land, finding things like these like fungal networks and hyphae strands are like really exciting and thrilling in exploring a compost pile. So yeah, what's so special about organic waste and why do we want to compost it? We, when you look at all of the waste that we generate, about 1/3 of our waste stream is made up of organic waste that's suitable for composting. So that, like, maybe take a moment to pause, like 1/3 of our waste can be composted. And that is an incredible opportunity to keep 1/3 of our waste stream out of landfill and instead in a compost pile that can be transformed into this rich finished compost that can be used to build healthy soils. So not only does it provide an opportunity to reduce the amount of materials going to landfill, it also creates a resource that can build healthy soils and sustain all these other things. And furthermore, a lot of landfills and waste management facilities are often located in low-income and communities of color. And this is a serious environmental justice issue as well. And so if you think of composting, and especially like community composting or managing your organic waste locally, you're reducing the amount of truck trips that would be going through low-income communities of color. And community composting, I think, really presents an opportunity to address a lot of the severe environmental justice issues that that hit New York City and other communities across the country as well. One other thing I really like to point out about food scraps and composting is that when food scraps actually end up in a landfill, they create methane, which is a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And so if you think about it, like you toss your banana peel, it ends up in a landfill and it's contributing to climate change. One of the reasons that I've been really excited about composting lately is that when you add compost to soil and it creates healthy soils are actually able to sequester excess carbon from the atmosphere and store it in the soil. I think that is like so cool. And when you think about food scraps generating methane and contributing to climate change in a landfill, it seems like a no-brainer to then want to create finished compost and build soil to reverse the effects of climate change. So that's one of my like big points that I try and point out to people. Another really cool thing about compost that you want to think about for why they even want to compost is that when you have healthy soils, it's actually able to absorb a lot more water. And so when we think about living in a coastal community facing future climate change effects and rising sea levels and flooding, if we have healthy soils, those healthy soils are able to absorb and hold on to water instead of it like running off of the surfaces and over inundating our sewer systems and causing flooding and all these other things. For all you gardeners out there, I'm sure a lot of you know that compost is great at adding nutrients back to the soil and just like creating healthy, I like to think of compost adding like a slow release of nutrients throughout the growing season versus adding like a chemical fertilizer, which just adds like bursts of chemicals and creates dependency on those chemicals. And another great thing, composting makes economic sense too. On a per ton basis, compost operations employ more people than landfill operations do. So I think like, you look at the environment, you think of like social and environmental justice issues, and composting just like makes a lot of sense to me and addresses a lot of social and environmental challenges that we face in our city. That was a lot, but I just want to pause for a second and see if anyone had any questions on that as well, or thoughts or comments. I'd love to hear. I'll give a second. All right, we can, if questions come up, we can revisit them. Okay, so, all right, oh wait, we have a question. If I find bugs as well as worms in my pile, is that okay? Yes, we want bugs, we want worms. We'll get to kind of like how to manage them in a good balance shortly. And you can compost in a bin and in a pile as well. So I'm gonna switch to share my screen for a second. And so you wanna compost. And this is a great little infographic that I came upon, and it like answered all the questions that I would want to cover in a workshop like this. And we're gonna kind of go into some of these details. But one of the things that I try and point out to people a lot of the times is like, so you want to compost, but like, what are your goals? Do you want to make compost? Do you have a desire to put the end use to a beneficial use? Yes, we will share this graphic. And are you just interested in keeping food scraps out of landfill? And you have no time, you're not really interested in getting your hands too dirty. And what are the options for you? And especially here in New York City, I'm gonna dive into some of these details, but a lot of cities have similar community composting programs as well. So I always start with one of the easiest ways for people to participate in a compost program is to find a food scrap drop-off site. Rely on others who have a composting system, who want to manage their community's organic waste. And in New York City, you can look up sites that are operated by Grow NYC and the New York City Compost Project. And actually right now, like since COVID, like the composting world has really like undergone some really big changes. And a lot of, like since the pandemic, a lot of like smaller community and volunteer-led groups have been born out of this desire to kind of fill this need to provide opportunities for New Yorkers to compost their food scraps. So if you're interested just in like participating in a community compost drop-off site, all you really need to do, kind of like how I mentioned earlier, is just collect your food scraps. Like we saw one of the other guests earlier, collecting their food scraps in a little bowl. I recommend that you store your food scraps in the freezer or the refrigerator just to help prevent things from getting smelly or attracting like fruit flies and the such. And an interesting thing is actually when you freeze it, it actually breaks down the cellular walls and makes the material easier and faster to break down once they end up in a compost pile. One thing to mention if you are participating in a community drop-off site is that different sites accept and choose not to accept specific materials. So I highly recommend that if you find a community drop-off site that you check with them to see what they accept. A lot of these community drop-off sites only choose to accept like kind of like vegan food waste, and which includes like apple cores, banana peels, maybe your coffee ground, tea bags, eggshells are perfectly fine. But what you don't want to bring to a site like that is like meats, cheeses, bones, oily prepared foods, like infected plants, or any like pet waste or kitty litter or things like that. Those things actually can be composted, but they need to be composted at a much larger scale, at the industrial scale of a compost facility. The problem with these materials is that they oftentimes have a lot of pathogens in them. And what's really magical about the composting process is as things decompose and get really hot, those pathogens are killed off. But a lot of times these smaller community-led composting initiatives are, they don't reach those high of temperatures. I'll get into that a little bit more shortly, but just as like a caveat for participating in a community-based drop-off site. So that's option number one. Option number two is, all right, so I want to compost at home, but I really only have like a little bit of space, and but I want to make compost, and I want to like have my hands be in the composting process. So the next thing that I would recommend, oh yeah, this is actually a picture of a food scrap drop-off site of what it could look like. So the next thing I would recommend for folks that want to have a little bit of space is to use a worm bin. There are these special worms called red wigglers, and they thrive in this like indoor compost bin. And essentially, to get set up with this indoor worm bin, you want like a plastic tote that you might like store your sweaters in at the end of the season type of thing. And what you essentially do is you get the worms, which we sell at the LES Ecology Center, or there's this other vendor that I've heard of folks getting worms from called Uncle Jim's Worm Farm, and he's online and you can order worms to be delivered to your house. But essentially, once you have your worms, you have your bin, you have your food scraps, what you want to do is create like a bedding out of shredded newspaper, and just essentially like add the worms to this bin with your food scraps, and then they just start to do the work. And along with the kind of bacteria and other little critters that might occupy the space in the worm bin. The worms get a lot of the credit, but there's a lot of microscopic players who play a big role in decomposition as well. Over time, the worms will start to break down your food scraps, and a rough rule of thumb is that for every pound of worms that you put in this worm bin, they can break down about 3.5 pounds of food scraps each week. So this is a great option if you're just like a small family, a single person who's not generating like a huge amount of material. But if you are and you want to kind of up your worm game, you could get a larger bin. I see someone asked if you can have worm bins structured outside, and you can. I would recommend, if you're having it outside, that you insulate the bin. These red wigglers are kind of just like us. They don't like it too hot. They don't like it too cold. So you want to make sure that the temperature can be regulated to like a 50 to 80 degree temperature. If things start to get too hot or too cold, your worms will unfortunately start to die off. And when worms start to die and if your worm bin is not doing well, it'll smell horribly. Like, I think the worst smell I've ever smelled was a worm bin that was on its way out. So if things start to smell extremely foul, you know that something's going wrong with your worm bin. And the other thing, just to point out, like if you do have a worm bin that's outside and you're fine with it kind of like dying off in the winter, a lot of times there's worm eggs on that will like sustain or like hibernate, if maybe that's the right word, over the winter, and then come spring, a population of worms will start to regenerate the outdoor worm bin as well. What do you do with a bad worm bin? You can add it to a bigger compost pile, is what I've done. It's just basically like it smells bad, but it's not going to be toxic or anything else. You could, if you don't have access to like a larger community compost bin, if you could find a patch of earth, maybe bury it. Otherwise, like the heartbreaking thing is, unfortunately, if you're not going to like bury it or like add it to some soil, to put it in a landfill, which hopefully you can find some other alternatives before doing that. So that's very, very quick and brief overview of worms. One of the handouts that I shared is a worm bin guide that like walks you through some of the more detailed things. So take a look at that if this feels like a composting style that seems right for you. The next option is to compost on your own. The folks that said that they have a tumbler, is this kind of something that looked like what you guys had, perhaps?
Well, it's a little smaller in plastic.
A little smaller in plastic, yeah, but it spins, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool.
So
So these are great for like a family, or if you live in like a larger apartment building and your neighbors want to have like a shared compost bin. Getting tumblers are a great option because they're like pretty neat and tidy. And so in like a residential setting, when folks a lot of times are worried about like the ick factor when it comes to composting, this kind of keeps things neat and tidy. The size is also really manageable. And as I'll get into detail in the next section, it doesn't require a whole lot of labor to like manage it, because if you want to mix the materials together, all you really got to do is spin this tumbler and it mixes all the organic materials back together. So again, this is great for folks who want to compost locally, who want to make compost on their own, and have a little bit more organic waste than like a worm bin could handle. Next, and somewhat related, is if you're at a community garden, or maybe you want to take over a vacant lot and turn it into a compost site, and you want to accept material from a larger group of neighbors, or if you live in a really big building and everyone's really excited to participate in your compost program, I recommend using a 3-bin, or actually in this picture, it's a 4-bin. This community garden turned the 3-bin into a 4-bin, and a metric to kind of identify, like each bay in this bin is able to hold about 800 pounds of food scraps over the course of like a couple of months of people adding. So the capacity of this bin is actually really impressive. The one thing I do want to point out is that if you do want to engage your community at a larger scale, I highly recommend that you make sure that you have a team, a network of volunteers that can support you in this. I can speak from experience. When I first started getting into composting, I was like at my community garden, I was like, guys, we need to open up our compost bin to the public and really start to like provide this opportunity for people to compost. And like I had a few people who were excited, And then it was like week after week, like so many people were dropping off their food scraps, but I didn't have a lot of people to help me like mix the materials together. And it was a lot of work. Like imagine taking a pitchfork and moving 800 pounds of food scraps all by yourself in an afternoon. Like you'll be sore the next day. And imagine doing that like week after week, and you'll get pretty exhausted pretty quickly. So in order to have a sustainable community compost program, you really want to have like a strong network of people who are all going to be there to support one another. And if someone's gone, the compost bin is not gonna kind of like go bad or start to create odors. And if you are engaging your public in a larger scale, I recommend figuring out a way to communicate with people, whether you have signage, whether you have an email list, or some other methods of just like having volunteers be there to talk to folks on a regular basis about what's going on, just to keep people in the know, because as someone kind of mentioned earlier, trying to figure out like what ingredients are okay to put in. You don't want someone accidentally to be dropping off like a chicken carcass in your community compost bin, because then you might start attracting rats, you might start getting bad odors, and the neighbors will, I guarantee anyone who ever has a problem in their neighborhood with regards to rats, they find the compost bin and they point to that as being the problem. And what I really want to encourage folks to think about and to feel empowered is that like composting does not have to smell. It does not have to attract pests. And a lot of times when community gardens have rat issues, it's usually like a cleanliness and a storage, and rats a lot of the times are just looking for habitat. And if there's like a rubble pile that a rat can like call home, that's what they're looking for a lot of the times. And the food source in the compost bin is important too, but usually if there's a rat issue, there's more to it than just the presence of a compost bin. I see Sarah's question. How is this 4-bin system broken out? Is it divided by material type? Great question, Sarah. So there's a few different ways that you can work with like a 3-bin or a 4-bin system. One of the ways that requires a lot more labor is that you essentially, do you guys see my mouse actually hover? Okay, so one way to do it is you always have like this bay 1 be where incoming material comes into. And once this bin over the course of a couple of weeks fills up, you move that full material from bin 1 into bin 2. And then bin 1 is empty and the community can start to add their food scraps back to bin 1. And then when bin 1 fills up again, bin 2, which is now probably like mostly decomposed, is moved into bay 3. Bay 1 moved into bay 2, and bay 1 is empty again. And so it's kind of this like moving material from one bay to the other. And as you get to the end, that's where your finished material would be and where you can harvest the finished material to put on your plants. The other way you could do it is just fill bay 1 till it's full, kind of like close it off, and then start to compost in bay 2 and fill it up and just like mix the material within the bin itself. And then when bay 2 is full, kind of close it from new incoming material and then start to compost in bay 3. And by the time bay 3 is full, hopefully the contents of bay 1 is fully decomposed. I hope that kind of answered your question. Okay, so these are a lot of smaller scale things. And I just wanted to show you guys the compost site that we have in the Lower East Side. I'm gonna just like play this video in the background so you can see what our site looks like. This was a recent video that someone put together. where you can see the food scraps being dropped off by the community members. And we take those food scraps also from other drop-off sites across the city, and we process those materials in really, really quite big compost piles that are called windrows. And what I'm about to kind of get into too is the essential elements for making compost. And as you're kind of seeing on the screen, it's this balance of carbon-rich materials and nitrogen-rich materials, which are our food scraps. So that is a little bit of that video. I'm just gonna have this kind of going in the background and you guys can watch. This is us turning a compost pile. Oh, there it goes. So you can see like we use some pretty heavy pieces of equipment in our process, but we collect 8 tons of food scraps each week, and that equals out to be about 3,500 to 4,000 people dropping off their food scraps with us each week, which is a lot. It's a lot of material, and if we were going to be managing that material by hand, that would be a pretty insane endeavor. So that's why at our scale we use some more sophisticated equipment, such as this compost Bobcat skid steer to turn our compost piles. But one of the, so as material enters onto our site, from start to finish, it takes about 3 to 6 months to fully decompose. And once that material is fully decomposed, we, here's another shot of our compost site. You can see all these elongated compost piles. One of the big things with our program is focusing on the distribution of the finished product as well. So we have volunteers help us prepare material to be donated out to community groups, and we then bring this material to folks who are gardening in the neighborhood, or a lot of schools we donate compost to, and a lot of community gardens as well. We also partner with the Parks Department and have our compost be donated to parkland to rebuild the soil in the parks as well. So kind of overall, like we have this very like larger scale community-based program where we are accepting food scraps from New Yorkers in Lower Manhattan. We're processing it all locally, and then that finished material is really making its way back to the local community to rebuild the soil and help folks grow food and do other agricultural and green endeavors. I see your question, Alexandra, and I'm about to get into ingredients and how to source it. So perfect timing on that question. But yeah, so that's kind of the work that we do. So back to, all right, so those are the kind of a variety of ways for you to compost, and maybe each of you are kind of thinking like, all right, worm bins are for me. Oh, I want to start like a compost revolution in my community. So I'm gonna like build a 3-bin with my neighbors, and we're all gonna compost scraps from everyone on the block. But basically, like whether you're composting at a very small scale or even like to the scale that we are, it's the same principles at play when you're creating a compost pile. And I always like to point to like, there are these like 5 factors. We've got the ingredients, which are, I'll just go through them. So we've got our ingredients, we've got our size of the ingredients, we've got moisture that we want to keep an eye on, oxygen, and then kind of like the size of the bin or the pile is also going to play a role in how things break down and how you want to manage it. Oh wait, but I mean, where do you get your carbon materials? All right, I'll answer that question too. So your ingredients. One one of my favorite ways to talk about a compost pile is specifically to the ingredients, where you want to have this balance of nitrogen-rich food scraps, and you want to have that balanced with carbon-rich browns. And basically, once you have this like perfect balance of those two ingredients, you're creating this ecosystem, this habitat for the microbes, the bugs, the worms, the nematodes, all the things you can't even see with your eyes. You're creating this habitat, this like food web of decomposers who are gonna break down things chemically, break down things physically, and these are really the rock stars of the composting process. Like you saw that video of our bobcat in action, like churning like huge buckets of compost, but like these like tiny microscopic critters are like the ones doing all the hard work. We get our food scraps from New Yorkers, and we get wood chips actually from Greenwood Cemetery for the most part. They're an amazing partner where they deliver like a giant dump truck once every like 2 weeks to our site, and that's where we get primarily most of our carbon-rich materials. We also partner with some wood shops. Wood shops, I should feel like my words got tangled there. To get untreated wood and like wood shavings and sawdust. This is an additional source of carbon that we add to our piles too. And I'm gonna put you on the spot, Allison, but hit Allison up for any wood shavings from her work that she does. Maybe she's got some to put
I
in.
donate to BK Rot.
Oh, awesome, yeah. But yeah, you can reach out to like local woodworkers and artists that are using wood if you're looking for an additional carbon source. There's also Greenwood actually allows the community to come in and just like walk in and fill up a bag of wood chips. So if you're in Brooklyn or have access to getting to Greenwood Cemetery, that's a great resource as well. Otherwise, I sometimes recommend folks, like if you see an arborist like doing work on your block, be like, hey, I'll take your wood chips, because they actually have to like pay to have those wood chips be disposed of. So a lot of times these community compost groups are a great resource for like being an economical way to get rid of wood chips from an arborist as well. I'm going to take a look at the questions for a sec. Would leaves and grass clippings also work as carbon? So, and this is an interesting thing, especially with like grass and other things. So grass, when it's freshly cut, is actually a source of nitrogen. But when it dries out and becomes less wet, it turns into more of a source of carbon. And I'm not going to get into this in that much detail, but like everything from like wood chips to food scraps have like a little bit of carbon and a little bit of nitrogen, but like when it's balanced overall, like wood chips are definitely on the carbon end of things and food scraps are definitely on the nitrogen. But these various like grass clippings, which is like and especially as grass clippings begin to dry, is like more in the middle. And same thing like with leaves, like freshly fallen leaves that might still be green are definitely more on like the nitrogen end of things. And as they dry, they transition to be this like source of like dry carbon. So I hope that doesn't confuse anyone, but you can get like pretty into the nitty gritty and with compost science and how to create like a perfect compost recipe. But I recommend to most people who are just composting on the small scale, like you can just do like a volume measurement of like 1 handful of food scraps, one to 2 handfuls of wood chips. And it is, I like composting, there's a science to it, but there's absolutely an art too. And once you kind of start to compost on your own and see things break down, it's like, that's where the learning and the knowledge really starts to come. I see the question about pests, and I'm gonna just put that on the bike rack for a moment. We'll come back to that when we talk about troubleshooting. So the other thing with ingredients I just want to touch on is the size of ingredients. You don't want to put like an entire apple, or like say a potato just started to go bad and you put like an entire potato in a compost pile. You want to cut things down, and I keep like waving my hand because my hand is like the rule of thumb. You want things to be cut to be smaller than your hand, but like thinner than your finger. If you put in an entire apple, actually,
Does someone have their dog? Does someone have a dog in the background? Oh, that's you. Okay, just kidding.
I know, I was like, this is a really loud dog. How bad is it?
It's all good. I was just checking if it was somebody else. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think the dog. Oh, poor
You're
dog.
good. Sorry.
Anyway, to make sure that things are chopped up. If they're not chopped up, they will, I've come across this where I'll find like an entire apple, and it'll be like a roasted apple that you find, and like you can like add cinnamon, and it's a delicious treat. So make sure those food scraps are cut and chopped into smaller pieces. Otherwise, it's just going to take forever to break down. Moisture, which is the third element in creating compost. You want to make sure that your pile is not too wet, not too dry. But what does that mean? The rule of thumb that I usually tell folks is when you kind of grab a pile of compost and you give it a squeeze, it should feel like a wrung out sponge. So like maybe like a few very small droplets should like be squeezed through your hand, but not much. If things start to get too wet, that's when things start to like get smelly and like have a lot of odors, and the pile starts to go anaerobic, which leads me to the next factor, which is oxygen. So we've got aerobic and anaerobic. Aerobic means composting with oxygen. Anaerobic is composting without oxygen. And when you're composting without the presence of oxygen, it is like, it's on par with the horrible odors of the worm bin, where it just gets smelly, it's like wet and mucky. Actually, folks with the tumbler, does your tumbler get wet and nasty and smell pretty bad? Yeah. Actually, yeah, that's the one thing with tumblers, because it's like more enclosed, like you don't get a lot of airflow. And so you really, when you're looking at the ingredients that you're putting in a tumbler, you might want to like add a little bit more of the carbon end of things into your bin. But yeah, like if oxygen is critical, and one of the, actually, I remember learning this where they were like, true or false, you're turning a compost pile by turning a compost pile, you're adding more oxygen into it. And that's actually false, because you really want to look at the beginning of your compost process and the ingredients that you're adding. And if the ingredients that you start with was not in balance, you're never going to quite like sustain, like get to that point of balance. One of the reasons that wood chips are really good is because they add, like if you think of like a wood chip structure, it adds little pockets of oxygen in a pile. But if everything is like imagine if you took sawdust and applesauce and mix them together, like that's going to be like a solid mucky thing that doesn't allow any like airspace and oxygen to kind of take over that space. Should bins be covered? So a good question actually about tying back to moisture. Should bins be covered from rain to prevent too much moisture? And this is something that you've got to kind of like look at over time. And where you're living in a region, and if like the compost bin might be located in like a sunny area of a garden or a yard. If the bin is susceptible to drying out more frequently, then I don't think you need to have it covered. But if it's in like a dark area that like doesn't get a lot of sun, you might want to consider covering it to prevent excess moisture, or you could battle that by just adding a little bit more of the carbon ingredients to your compost pile at the beginning, kind of knowing that when it does rain, this pile is going to absorb much more water. So like you want water, and like the compost bin that I managed at my community garden, we didn't have it covered, and like we kept our ingredient ratio to be like pretty 50-50, and it was a pretty good mix, and we didn't have to worry about things getting like too dense with water. And then the last kind of element is the size of the bin and the size of the pile. One thing where this kind of comes into play, like a worm bin is much smaller and is not gonna get very hot. Like a lot of times people think of compost piles and they think of like the heat that's generated from it. The heat that a compost pile can generate is dependent on the volume of that bin or that pile. Usually the magic number you want to strive for in a compost pile is about like 100, at least 120 degrees. I should say you don't want your worm bin getting to be 120 degrees, but if you're composting in an outdoor setting, you want to aim to get to be 120 degrees. 130 is kind of this like sweet spot for like compost to be breaking down really quickly. But the upper threshold is about 160 degrees, 170 degrees. You really don't want it getting hotter than that, because then you start to kill off any of the beneficial microbes that are in your compost pile that you want to be present because they bring a lot of value. And so that's kind of, but also I should point out, like if you're composting in your backyard, or you just want to compost leaf, like a pile of leaves, like that pile is not going to get much hotter than like 100 degrees. And that's perfectly fine too, because things will just decompose much more slowly. And so that's another like question for you to consider in what kind of style of bin you want to use, is like, is your goal to create like compost here and now, or is it more like I'm going to be lazy and just like let things decompose over time? And so that's kind of another way to look at it, is like, what's your goal and how fast you want to make compost? Oh, I did not address, what if you're in a hot climate? With regard to watering, is that the right focus to that question? Like if you're in a hot climate and should you cover or uncover your compost bin, you would want to leave it uncovered, because a lot of times in the hot environments, things are going to dry out faster. And if things are drying out faster, then the compost pile can deal with a little bit more moisture from the rainfall. But actually, this also brings up an interesting point.
Possibly like the ideal temperature of your compost pile? Like, does it make a difference if you're in a hot climate, like the ideal temperature of the pile to get to?
No, and actually, maybe now's the time I can show this other video. So this is going to be a video of the middle of winter in New York City. Like, that's hot. Look at all that steam. Again, this goes back to that creation of your initial recipe. If you create that habitat for those microbes to take over a compost pile, they're going to be breaking down your food scraps. They're going to be generating that heat. And even in the middle of winter, this compost pile is getting to be 150 degrees on the inside. So if you're in the hot climate as well, the compost pile will kind of like sustain itself in a sense, where you don't necessarily have to worry about like trying to cool it down. the microbes, if you kind of think of it in a larger like ecological sense, will kind of like sustain and create the environment that they want if you've kind of given them the right ingredients. So one of the other questions that I often get is does a compost pile need to be in a sunny spot? And it doesn't necessarily have to. Like the heat will like give it a little like temporary boost, but it's not going to like keep the compost pile going hot for a really long time. Hope that kind of addressed that question. So one other question, do you ever add anything like lime? No, I don't. And this is where like you can look up like how to compost guides and they'll say like you need to add worms, you need to add lime, you need to like add these things to like kickstart your composting process. And what I'm here to tell you is that you have access to everything you need to compost. You've got your food scraps or your lawn clippings or whatever the ingredient might be, and you have dried leaves, you have your wood chips. If you mix those two together in the right ratio of like a 50-50 blend, that's all you need. And one of the things that specifically with the worms, people are like, oh, I need to add worms to my compost pile. Don't worry about it. Worms like find their way to a compost pile no matter where you are. I was working with a group that had these like kind of like a tumbler system in the middle of a concrete like side like parking lot, and they had so many worms in their bin, and they're like, how'd they get here? And I'm like, good question. I don't know. Yeah, like Sarah said, like let nature do her thing. They could like there could be egg larvae on a leaf that makes it into the compost pile, or there could be bacteria. I mean, bacteria is on everything. Bacteria could be on your banana peel that you put in your pile, and it like has the perfect environment, so it starts to flourish and multiply. So I really like composting. Definitely feels like this daunting activity and a daunting process, but really like I hope you can all go away from this with some like motivation and some kind of empowerment to like be a part of the process, be patient, kind of see how things go, and kind of see how all these little critters end up playing out in a compost pile. And that we're kind of getting up to time, and so I know we've kind of had a pretty open dialogue, but any other questions that folks have?
Irene had to go, but she did ask to hear more about the differences between fresh grass cuttings and leaves versus dried up cuttings. And I'm wondering, in case anybody else is a little confused on that still, if you could speak more to it.
Yeah. I mean, it's essentially, if you think of like all this organic matter, whether it's food scraps, whether it's your grass clippings, dry leaves, wood shavings, wood chips, eggshells, it's all kind of on this spectrum of like nitrogen to carbon, and everything has a little bit of each. And what's interesting about like as fresh material starts to dry, like, and maybe this is where my knowledge of like chemistry hits a wall, where I'm like, something happens and it becomes less of a nitrogen based material and starts to transition into this like drier carbon dominated material. Magic, I don't know.
And Lily had asked from before, can worm bins attract pests like mice and cockroaches? So less the rats. I don't know if there's a difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, I've seen sometimes cockroaches in a compost pile. I've never been too worried about that.
Also,
I get
inside, just because I've had like, you know, mouse infestation issues.
yeah. So, but the mice, I've seen, because these, at least with like a 3-bin, usually like the wire mesh is like still big enough for a mouse to fit its like little frame into. And if you do, so the problem with a mouse, or even like with rats, like what you're worried about is the potential pathogens that are on those critters, and those pathogens kind of like getting in a compost pile, and people just like kind of, they don't want living things like that in their compost pile. But usually they're like I said before, they're looking for habitat, and a compost pile is like a warm home for them to take over. So I oftentimes see mice taking over compost piles in the wintertime, and then you'll come to spring and they'll like have created a little nest in it. But to combat that, and to combat any like pests like rats or mice, or maybe even cockroaches would fall into this category too, but like if you're actively managing your pile, and this is where having like a strong network of volunteers comes into play, where if you're turning those compost piles on a weekly basis, you're not really giving these pests an opportunity to settle in and create a home. Like if you're disturbing it on a regular basis, they're being mad. They'll be like, I can't, why are you tearing apart my home? I guess I'll go find a home somewhere else. And they'll go find a compost bin somewhere else where people aren't turning it on a regular basis. That's kind of my pest management 101.
But you've never had like seen issues with, I'm more speaking about like a worm bin indoors, since that's an indoor thing. Like
I've never heard of
or mice getting into like an indoor worm bin.
I mean, I could imagine that happening, but I haven't really heard much about that. And same like with cockroaches in an indoor worm bin. Like, I mean, cockroaches make their way anywhere in a kitchen where there's like residue for them to nibble on or whatever they do. But I think like in a worm bin, you can, like you have a lid. And so if you just make sure that that lid is secure and there aren't like any like big holes for the cockroaches to explore, like hopefully they won't like set up residence in your worm bin. One of the things you do have to worry about with the worm bin are these like white mites that could kind of infest a worm bin. And most of the time when that happens, it means things are getting like a little too wet. And what you can do is like add more dry newspaper bedding to keep the mites from continuing to populate. Yeah.
Sarah asks how often you turn over the bin, weekly?
If you're like super ambitious, like if you have pest issues, absolutely turn that bin weekly. If you're trying to make compost really quickly, also turn it weekly. But again, like if pests aren't an issue, and your initial compost recipe was really balanced, you could let that sit for a few weeks, for a month, and it probably won't be that bad. The worst thing that could happen is that when you do eventually turn that pile, you might get like a pocket of anaerobic activity where it'll just like be a really smelly pocket when you open it up, and it'll go away eventually. But if you have neighbors next to your compost bin, they might be like, wow, what's going on? Which has happened and happens. There's a lot of smells in New York. People need to like chill out. Any other questions? Because the other thing I'll just mention, and that this is in the email as well, is, yeah, so you want to get involved with a community group. There's this amazing resource. There's this Google group called the New York City Community Compost, and join that if you want to get fun emails in your inbox about weird compost questions. Or if you're just trying to figure out like where's your closest compost drop-off site, it's a really great group. You can just post questions and usually someone chimes in with an answer. Another great way to connect with composters in your community is to look for a community garden and volunteer with them. Volunteers or community gardens are always in need of volunteers, and most community gardens have a compost bin, and so that's a great way to get involved as well. Farmers markets, farmers love compost. The Grow NYC is the organization that coordinates most of the farmers markets in New York City, so chat them up about composting. They're a great source of wisdom. And then there's a lot of really great groups across the city that are doing community composting, kind of like what I showed you earlier. Big Reuse is a group that's located in Queens and in Brooklyn. Earth Matter is out on Governor's Island. The botanicals across the boroughs have really amazing composting programs, so you can reach out to them too. Grow NYC, like I mentioned, BK Route, which was mentioned earlier, they're an incredible social justice driven organization in Bushwick. So if you're in that area, check them out and volunteer with them. Common Ground is in Manhattan, and they do micro hauling and do some really great work. And for those in the Bronx, Green Fiend is another kind of micro hauler that does composting up in the Bronx. And the woman who runs that is really incredible and actually creates compost themed wraps. So check her out if you want some eco rap music to listen to.
Sarah just asked about compostable bags.
Oh boy, I could talk about compostable bags forever. Compostable bags are an interesting topic. So they can, if you're dropping off, like at the drop-off sites that we operate, we accept compostable bags. But a lot of these like compostable bags or like compostable plastics really only break down at a larger industrial scale facility. Like we even see if like we get a compostable fork, it does not break down throughout our composting process. And so that needs to be composted at an industrial scale facility. And the other thing about, and I don't want to be like starting rumors or anything, but like thinking about these like chemically generated compostable plastics, whether they're bags or not, like a lot of times they just break down into smaller pieces. And the materials that are used to create these compostable plastics are like genetically modified corns and other things that are like not the best. So I always, first and foremost, just encourage people to reuse like a container that they can drop off their food scraps in, whether it's getting like a yogurt container, like you're reusing your yogurt container, or those like clamshell salad things that you get your arugula in or whatever. Or there are all these like really like fancy bougie compost buckets that are made of metal and will last forever. I recommend folks use that versus using plastic bags or like buying a specific product to carry your materials. You ask if these compostable bags are best in the trash. So this gets to the question of like figure out who is processing the food scraps that you're dropping off with. Like if you're dropping off at Union Square Green Market, we accept the compostable bags, and they break down in our process, so we're happy to accept them. A smaller community garden might not have done like a test to see if that material breaks down, so they might not be as comfortable accepting that material, which means that unfortunately those bags would have to end up in the trash, or those forks or whatnot. And maybe the group wants to experiment and they can use whatever compostable product that you have to test to see if it does break down. But there's this gray line, especially when you're composting at a very small community scale, of the ability for these compostable plastics to really break down.
On that note, I'm sorry to interrupt. Does anybody have any last questions that they want to stick in the chat real fast, and I can just like screenshot those and have Renee answer in an email later? Because we are at 7, which means that we are out of time. Thank you all so much for being here, for participating in our first workshop. Yeah. Thank you, Renee. This is so informative. I've learned a lot, particularly about the freezer, also about getting worms from you guys, and about Uncle Jim's. Is that where we're at? Jim's? Yes.
Yeah.
I'm gonna give everybody like a minute to stick a question in the thing if they want. Other than that, Renee, where can people keep up with you if they want to find you, ask you questions?
Yeah. So I think my email address was shared in the thing, and I sent an email out. So you all got my email. Shoot me an email with any questions. You can follow the work of the Ecology Center. We're on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook at LES Ecology CTR. You can also follow me on Instagram. I post a little bit about composting, a little bit about ceramics, and other like creative endeavors that I do. And it's just my name. It's _ Renée Crowley _ So you can stay connected to me that way too. I often like share a lot of compost work that I do. And yeah, I hope to keep in touch. Drop me a line if you ever have a question about anything compost.
And as just a reminder, we are recording this now, and so this workshop will live again on our website, probably like in a week or so. You'll get a link afterwards, and you have all of the PDFs that Renee has emailed you, which has like a real breakdown on how to set up all of these systems. We'll also be emailing it to you in Spanish. If you haven't received that already, that will also live on our website. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
This is wonderful. Bye.
Bye.